Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program broadcast. It's December 30th, 2019. This is our last broadcast of the year before the new year. So welcome, and I hope your holidays so far have gone well for all of you, and you've had some time to enjoy with your families there at home. I'm back from vacation, and on the precipice of the new year, I thought I'd talk about some things, kind of weaving in the themes that we usually associate with the new year, with some of the clinical work that families are doing. And tonight's broadcast, I think, is important because there are some ideas, some tools that I'm going to debunk to a certain extent. I'm going to talk about behavioral contracts and what I perceive to be the limited value in them. And yet, it's one of the most common, prolific tools out there that are suggested for families, but very, very rarely do I see them have the value that people anticipate or hope that they have. So I'll get to that as we go along. So tonight's broadcast is the New Year Therapeutic Goals and Objectives. Let's talk first about the idea of goals. I talk about this story where I was working with a young man years ago, and we were discussing things during a family visit with his parents. And at one point, the parents were extolling on the family's values and really in contrast to the way that this young man was living his life, talking about the family value. These are our values, and kind of listing them off and giving examples. And the young man was listening patiently for the most part until at one point he burst out and said, "These aren't family values; these are parental values." And I hadn't thought about it that specifically, but I thought he had a really valid point. And not that that diminishes them by any means, but it doesn't. There's something about the idea of family values that presupposes that the child has adopted them. There are definitely things that parents aspire to instill in their children, but this young man was protecting what I call the sovereignty of the self, right? That he has the right to choose. And it's not even that he won't choose or follow along the same value system as his parents. He was just verbalizing the right to be an independent self in that experience. So as we start to explore this evening, this idea of goals for our children, it really needs to be rooted in the concept of differentiation. And differentiation is the concept of individuation, right? Individual selves in a family. And the potential for connections between those selves. But that doesn't mean that there's overlapping, over identification, and erasing of each other. I was meeting with a client not too long ago who said, as they were contemplating their own sobriety, this idea that it's hard for me, this is a young adult, it's hard for me to consider the question about whether or not I identify as an addict or an alcoholic, because I can't separate that from my parents' perspective, my parents' belief, my parents' agenda to try to convince me that I am that. So the minute I start to consider it, the minute I become confused because of the pressure that my parents are putting on me to adopt that, to identify with their belief system, with their perspective in the world. So that's the foundation tonight, the backdrop tonight for talking about goals and objectives for your children. Families who have identified themselves, this is from some of the research that I've read, families who identify themselves as successful, so that's their own definition, have fewer rules than families that don't identify themselves as successful. I've thought about this for the years since I read about this research, and I thought, well, maybe that's because families that have children that are struggling need to come up with more rules. But I think there's something richer to this process. I think the idea of rules, and it'll go to the concept, the idea of behavioral contracts this evening, the idea that we can legislate behaviors, that we can identify, kind of manualize what it means to become a healthy person, a healthy self in the process, I think is an error, right? It's more fluid, it's more conceptual. One of the things that I'll talk about tonight, the risk that we run, especially when we have children that are struggling with substance abuse disorder or mental health issues, especially in those cases, we tend to focus on behaviors. And I've talked about this recently, that when we focus too much on behaviors, or if that becomes our focus, The behavior or the symptom, the defense, if you will, wins. Because a primary function of a symptom, of a defense, is to mask, to distract everybody involved from the underlying wound, the pain that lies authentically beneath the surface. And so if we reduce our children, this becomes a great challenge because our children's and our symptoms are so effective at provoking anxiety and worry and stress in others. They're so effective at that it's hard to remain grounded and calm and curious in response to the symptom or defense. That is why we need outside help so desperately. We need somebody riding alongside of us, somebody offering us perspective who's less triggered, a mentor, a sponsor, a therapist to help us sort that out. Not that they get to, again, dictate our feelings and our belief systems, but just to give us some perspective, to give us an explanation, to be able to respond to the defense without the raw, triggered fear that comes from it, from those who love the person who's struggling. It's very important, and I'll talk a lot tonight about the difference between their goals and your goals. Again, it's not to diminish the need that they have to develop a sense of self, to develop goals, objectives for themselves. That is important. It's an important part of developing who you are. But it's very important that we learn language, that we talk and interact with others in such a way not to, again, impose our belief system on top of them. Now, I'm going to say this as clearly as I can, because when I do trainings, especially with my clients, with my therapists, when I do training, I often get the pushback when I use language like I've already used this evening, that part of our job is to facilitate a process that helps people develop healthy goals, a healthy self, a healthy trajectory for themselves. And what I say to them, which I'll say to you tonight, if you might have an inkling, that same kind of instinct to respond, is this is how you do it. The most important contribution we can make to the development of a healthy self in our children is to develop language that values differentiation. Differentiation that I've already defined tonight. So learning to separate and distinguish between your goals and their goals. Like I've said already, learning to distinguish between behavior and underlying mental health. I took a phone call from an inquiring parent today of a young adult client, and the discussion we had, the client was showing very little, or the potential client was showing very little motivation for change, but was setting some very distinct boundaries with the family, with the extended family. And the parent was asking me, how can I, really the word was manipulate. She didn't use that word, but how can I increase change in my child? And I spent a good half an hour explaining, first listen to what the behavior is trying to tell you. There's a reason why she's setting distance between herself and other extended family members. And until she has some confidence that you want to learn about why that's happening, you're not going to get far with her at all. So get curious, stay curious, let go and abandon your objective, at least for the time being, and get curious about what the behavior, what you would call the symptom, is trying to say for her, because it is speaking in a kind of a coded way, that the way that dreams and lies are coded, right? Indirectly, passively. Part of all of this is learning to distinguish between what you can't and can't control. I mean, that's a fundamental ingredient in healthy self, is learning and practicing behavior, practicing thinking, practicing living in a way that demonstrates that you know the difference between what you can and can't control. And again, it's Some of you might be familiar with accidents that involve a drunk driver. And then what is so often the case is that the drunk driver is the least harmed in these accidents. And there's a reason for that. There's a physical reason for that. And that is because their body is relaxed. They're not resisting the damage of the accident. And so they're just flopping around like a rag doll and not getting as injured. The instinct that we have to brace ourselves against potential disasters. And if the disasters are small enough, if you trip and fall and catch yourself, you're going to prevent, for example, hitting your face on the ground. But the more significant the force, the more likely that you are to injure yourself as a result of trying to stop it, right? We know that. We know that tension that comes from trying to control things creates a certain kind of brittleness in us, physically and psychologically. I experienced whiplash one time in the wilderness. I was driving and hit a big, huge hole that I couldn't see. And because of that, my head jerked back and forth, and I tried to stop it. And because of that, my neck strained, and for days, for weeks, I was in pain. If I could have relaxed, I could have gotten through that with much less of an injury. So it's our attempts to control things that we can't control that sometimes cause the injury. It's important that we understand the function of boundaries for ourselves. It's so common, especially when we have somebody that we care about that's struggling with mental health or addiction issues. It's so common to consider boundaries in the context of how will these impact the other person? How could we not think that way, right? How can we not think that way about a child or a loved one of ours who's in pain? So again, like most of what we talk about on these broadcasts, it's counterintuitive. Boundaries are about self-care. Boundaries are about setting some distance between you and others, you and other behaviors that cause you to feel safe. Now, they do have the effect of teaching, of modeling things. They do have the effect of presenting a lesson, but that is not the primary purpose. That goes back to that first idea that I shared with you, that families that identify as successful may have fewer rules because they're not trying to engineer children, right? They're not trying to engineer each other. They're more likely developing a healthy sensibility and living in it, living with it. And things tend to organize in healthier ways when that becomes the project. For those of you who might be new to this, I'm going to say this emphatically and clearly. The work that we talk about on these broadcasts at Evoke in general is a transformation, a fundamental transformation. So I would encourage you to keep listening to the ideas. This is the work of codependency. This is the work of loving somebody who's struggling and learning how to show up differently. And that's all you can do. And staying away from the instinct to try to control. And I won't get too philosophical or on too much of a tangent here, but I saw the Star Wars movie over the holiday, over my vacation. And that's essentially what that message is about. There's two sensibilities. One is about fear and subsequent control, and the other one is about love and letting go. And it's that tension in the human psyche that's constantly at play that we're up against here when we have children that are struggling. I'm going to talk about issues around the behavioral contract. Again, behavioral contracts are perhaps one of the most common suggested ideas, one of the most common assignments given to families when a child seems to be spiraling. And I'm just going to say this at the outset, just to kind of erase any resistance that might be there. In my 25 years of doing this, never, not one time, with all of the hundreds of behavioral contracts that I've seen, Not one time has a child ever violated the behavioral contract expectations and rules, clearly spelled out. Not one time have they ever done that and responded with something like, you know what, you're right. I clearly broke the rule here that's clearly stated, and I deserve the consequence. Never once have I seen a child respond anywhere close to something like that. They respond with looking for loopholes, for saying I signed it under duress, for going back and arguing with the stated rule that's been written down, right? Trying to renegotiate it. So the premise that I want to challenge and debunk tonight is behavioral contracts as they're currently or commonly used are virtually useless, because I think there's this fantasy, this hope that they will do the work for you, right? If you have some tough and thoughtful and well worked out negotiations where everybody seems to agree on what is written, then the work is done. Never have I seen it work like that. The only thing that I've really seen behavioral contracts work for, and it's a minority of the times that they get used, is they give the parents some clarity and some associated confidence, maybe with co-parents to kind of work it out and be clear. And they give parents the comfort and confidence to be able to follow through with things. But regardless, you're going to get virtually the exact same type and quality of pushback after a written contract as you will before one. So if you can abandon that and use it for what it has value for, like just giving you clarity and comfort that you've communicated it, if you can just internalize that idea of it, that aspect of it, then go ahead and use them. So here's an old set of bullet points that I came up with when talking about contracts that I'll go over in the context of what I've already stated. First of all, I say this: the contract will consist of several parts. The first thing to decide is the expectations or basic limits you expect your child to comply with in order to live at home and be with you. The second thing is to consider that it is important to realize that after a program like Evoke, it will better serve the family if you start with higher levels of structure and move towards lower levels of structure as they demonstrate responsibilities, right? That you don't owe it to your child to open up the box too much in the beginning. That's one of the common mistakes that I see parents make. It's okay. I've always said to families, if a child can handle a yes, then they can handle a no. If they can handle all of the challenge that comes along with the privilege that they're requesting, then they can handle the boundary of a no. That in essence is a lot of what families are struggling with before they come to Evoke. Is the fact that a child is bumping up against a no, a boundary. So they've already been at Evoke. They've already had this model. So they're already used to this approach and this philosophy. Not with you, right? You're the mother tongue, if you will. So they're going to test it out with you. The students in Klein learn that they must earn trust while they're at Evoke, rather than having it granted arbitrarily to them. But so many parents are afraid of disconnection, rejection, guilt, and fear that they'll often compromise their boundaries, open them up wider to begin with, in the hopes that will create greater buy-in with the child. Also, if you start off on the permissive end of the continuum, it's more difficult going backwards. There's a great book that I was asked to read 30 years ago called The 1 Minute Manager. And it gave an analogy that I took to be a true story about two dynasties and emperors that ruled over these dynasties back to back. And one emperor started off very, very strict and loosened up toward the end of his reign. And the other emperor started off very, very loose and had to tighten the strings as things went along. And the emperor who moved from strict to loose died beloved by his people. And the emperor that started off loose and got strict ended up hated by his people. I remember this concept as a student in school, that my favorite teachers started off extremely strict. And from there, flexibility, openness, creativity emerged, came out of it. Be as specific as you can. Be specific rather than general. I'm going to give some examples when we get through all these bullet points. Avoid expectations which cannot be measured and will lend themselves to interpretation. So if you're going to write this down, phrases like be respectful won't make sense because you're going to debate over what respectful means. So if you're thinking of something specific, be specific with it. Think about positive and negative consequences. Think about earning privileges and thinking about losing opportunities and privileges, and be clear about those. Natural and logical consequences, right? This comes from, again, I'm reluctant. The behavioral contract is something I give out reluctantly because it can be misused, like I said, but it's better to have consequences. We know that in behavioral theory, that the more related, the sooner that it happens after the consequences, the behavior, excuse me, the more likely it is to have an impact. So things that are related to it, don't have everything related to the car. And sometimes I think some of the most challenging consequences for me as a father are just letting the child suffer from what they've created, right? Letting them wear stinky, dirty clothes if they haven't put them in the hamper, if that's an expectation, for example. Letting them clean up their own mess. Those kinds of things. That can become one of the challenging things for me to follow through on. It's okay to negotiate as long as you can find ways to still hold on to the core value that you're trying to express through the boundary, through the limit, through the consequence. Do the best that you can to be unified. Doesn't have to be 100%. And where it might be different, especially if there are two homes, that'll be something that they'll have to deal with. I used to think that this had to be at the cost of all else, unification. And now I realize people can be successful and have different rules in different houses. That's the way it is in the world. I mean, ideally, we're on the same page and we can find ways to compromise. And I've always said that sometimes, you know, play the long game. Really, when parents love their children, they both have the same goal. They might have different means, different ideas about the means to get there. And so sometimes let the other version, the other way, see if it'll work and really back up to the long game. But that'll take some help, some support. Understand that there are tiers, right? Not everything has the nuclear response, right? Zero tolerance policies are probably not going to be a good idea with everything. And that really frightens parents, right? Because it's easy to understand black and white. It's harder to kind of work through the gray. But again, doing this for a long time, I found that zero tolerance policies, it's like calling your bluff, right? Not every relapse is of equal quality and value. Even programs where kids behave the same way make this different decisions about what to do with that child based on the context and how the child responds after the fact. So I give some examples on the do's and don'ts with regard to the philosophy. You can have your car. The examples of don'ts. You can have your car back, your TV back, and go out with your friends and your old friends. You've earned it at Evoke, and I think you deserve it. That's the philosophy of giving them all of it first. It's okay to have some limits. Instead, you can make decisions like, we'll start with these rules. If you follow them and outline for the first month, you can have the car privileges. Specific. Don't say things like come home at a reasonable time or be respectful to your parents. More specifically, say things like be home at 8 on weeknights or participate in family therapy sessions with Dr. Smith. Positive and negative. The don't is simple, a contract without any list of privileges earned. I suggest that you have a column of consequences if the expectations are not met and a column of and list of privileges if the consequences are met over a period of time. If you miss a curfew, you can't go out the next night. If you meet the curfew requirements for the first month, we'll extend it a half an hour. Again, natural and logical consequences. If you get a D on a report card, you're grounded, versus if you get a D, you have to come home each night for 3 hours and do your homework. Your work's going to be checked before you go out. Again, these are just concepts. The literal nature will have to be decided by you. Unification. Your father wants you to go to AA, so I guess we will. Or after some negotiation with the parents, we've decided that you go to AA meetings, right? Finding that way to kind of come together. And learn that there is some room for negotiation. The difficulty with negotiation is that people have had the experience of letting go of their values, right? Negotiating themselves right out of kind of the core principles that are involved in the boundaries. So the don't example is you can't see Jim and that's final, or no smoking, versus saying something more like, well, we just don't want you around your negative peer influences, but you can see Jim at our house. Or if you want to hang around him, he's gonna have to submit to a drug test. Or we want you to focus on abstaining from drugs. It'll hurt us to see you smoke, but you can choose it if you want to. Obviously, this is with adults where it's legal. Not in our home. We just don't want to smell the smoke. And again, I'm not trying to suggest my way of being. So those are some of the concepts that you can reference in the making of your contract, if it's something that you think will give you the value, the clarity, and the comfort that you're looking for. I've said this already. My perspective on contracts has changed over the years. I have not encouraged a family to use a contract in well over 10 years, probably more than that, because I saw, like I said at the outset of the broadcast tonight, so little value in the way that they were executed. Like I said, it doesn't do the work for you. It can give you some more confidence, but it's not going to help you win the fight or the argument. If you're in the argument or the fight or the debate, you've already lost. So what is the purpose? Parental clarity and confidence. And it's not going to create some sort of self-regulation by the child. I suppose it could, but I've never seen it happen. And again, it goes back to the main principle that I talk about, which is tools aren't the thing. I get asked about tools more than anything else, probably because they're easier to understand. But tools aren't really the thing. Tools can help you develop the sensibility. They can be a practice for you, but the sensibility must be nurtured and grown and incorporated over time. Sensibility is, when I say that, I mean the way of being, the way of thinking, the way of understanding. So in light of the idea of focusing on what you can control, I came up with an invitation for some goals for you, parents, in 2020. I have a list of books I would invite you to read. The Journey of the Heroic Parent, of course, Parenting from the Inside Out, The Dance of Anger, The Drama of the Gifted Child, and my new book, The Audacity to Be You, which will come out in January of next year, January 2020. Go to your meetings, go to your 6 12-step meetings, and consider getting a sponsor. Get a therapist that's just for you. Attend an intensive. I listed on here Evoke and Onsite. Onsite workshops is the intensives that I first attended, that we send our employees to, because we don't send them to our intensives. And I put this out there purposely because it's not about selling a product, right? I go to Onsite every year. There are other great ones. There's the Meadows in Arizona. Tara Holbrook, a colleague of mine, has one in, I think it's called Lighthouse, up in Idaho, right? Bridge to Recovery in Bowling Green, Kentucky. They're Breakthrough at the Caron Foundation in Pennsylvania. The House at Ocala with Judy Crane. There are great programs all over the country. So If you're suspicious that I'm selling a product, go to one of those. Do your work. Get a springboard into understanding what your work is, or if you had some therapy and you feel like it might be stalling or stuck or need an accelerator, go to one. I'm biased. I think that Evoke does it the best, but if that all that becomes a barrier to you, go to one of these other ones. Use podcasts. And the reason I put this on here is because the work that I do, the work that I teach, I hear this all the time from parents. It takes a while. I've had parents describe it taking years. In my own experience, it took years. The hope came not because I quickly transformed, but because I realized early on that the problem was inside of me. That the barrier to my serenity, to my peace of mind, to the meaningfulness of my life was inside of me. That the other people around me, they were interchangeable, right? I would find the same kinds of challenges and difficulties if you started the game over again. So I like podcasts because it's a listening and a reminding of a certain kind of sensibility and a certain kind of thinking. So use Evokes or find others that work for you. Create a relapse prevention plan for you. We again, we think about relapse prevention plans when it comes to our children. Create one for you. And this is really important. Share it with your child. Start to give them some language so that they can push back and say, Mom, Dad, you're getting on me again. I'm going to repeat a story that I've told a few times that happened this summer between my 11-year-old, who just turned 12, she was 11 at the time, and my mother, my 11-year-old child, and my mother. After my mother, when they were pulling up to a drive-through at a frozen custard around the 4th of July, my mother raised her voice and yelled at the cousins, including my 11-year-old daughter in the back seat. And after getting scolded, my 11-year-old said, I want to share something. She said, I think it's okay to set boundaries, but I don't think it's okay to shame us. That's my 11-year-old. She said the same thing about her teacher 2 years ago. And she was right in both cases. Children can learn these things early. And especially if we start to parent from a place of healthy boundaries, clear communication, this new sensibility, instead of by imposing shame or guilt or fear on our children, we can make a dramatic difference, and it's never too late. So make your relapse prevention plan, identify what your stumbling blocks are, what your pitfalls are, what your red flags are. Start to share that with your child. The fear, of course, for many parents is that they're going to lose power, right? That the child is going to use it against them. It doesn't work that way. None of these things compromise your boundaries. They compromise tools of manipulation, but they do not compromise boundaries at all, even a little. They don't open up things for more debate because a boundary is a boundary. But communication, shaming, guilting, threatening, trying to control people through emotional coercion, all of those things need to be discussed. Differentiation, over-identification, enmeshment, all of those things ideally would be talked about in families. Relearn, renegotiated. Work on the 8 tools. I listed here, for those of you that are watching visually, if you just Google Brad Reedy and 8 tools, you'll find the blog that I did that also has a link to the podcast and the webinar for the 8 tools. These are the 8 things that I identified that successful families suggest that they practice often. So what's the take home for this evening? Work on your differentiation. You understanding what it means to be a self and what it means to be connected to your children is the greatest contribution. I was talking with this client that I referred to, this inquiring client earlier today, and I was discussing this idea. I used the story of Bob Dylan in the 1990s when Bob Dylan's son had a #1 album, and a reporter asked him, asking him the question, How do you feel about Jacob's success? His son's name is Jacob. And Bob said, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter to me one way or the other. And for a long time, I thought he was just being a jerk. But the more that I've thought about it, the more I realized it doesn't matter. My son just got into the school of his choosing, his number one chosen school in the United States. And I've had a couple of people congratulate me. And that doesn't even make sense to me. I'll pass on congratulations to him because he worked his butt off for that. But to congratulate me for my child's accomplishments doesn't make sense. You can congratulate me for patience when I show it, for compassion when I show it, for a parenting skill that I've developed, but to congratulate me for my child's accomplishments doesn't make sense. When I've shared this sensibility of differentiation with clients, almost every time they've looked at me straight in the eyes and said, nobody thinks that way. In essence, they're saying nobody is that separate from their child. And they're laden with guilt and shame. We have to understand attachment. What does it mean? We have to distinguish between anxious attachment and love, because they're not the same and they're not on a continuum. Anxious attachment is not too much love. It's not enough self-development, not enough differentiation. Understand the dynamics that exist between your issues and your child's issues. But to do that, you have to surrender power, what you think is effective power. Improve self-care and get support for the added stress that comes from having a child that struggles. You know, I think most of us enter parenting with a couple of ideas. Number one, that the love that we feel will be the solution. And number two, most of us come into it with lessons from what not to do from our childhood, from others that we've seen. And we generally think that that's enough. And most of us parent by telling our children how we feel, as if to suggest that how we feel is somehow a reflection of them and the quality or direction in their life. If we're upset, sad, scared, frustrated, angry, they're headed in the wrong direction. If we're happy, proud, feeling positive, then they're headed in the right direction. And yet it's this very dynamic that creates a vulnerability in the child towards depression, towards peer pressure, toward the loss of self. So understand the dynamics between your issues and your child's issues. Get care for yourself so that you can work that out with somebody else. And develop a practice, whatever the practice is: yoga, meditation, support groups, therapy, podcasts, readings. Learn to set boundaries and do battle with guilt in your life. If in this process, I believe this to be true, and I'm open to see an exception to it, but I haven't seen it yet. If in this process you don't bump up against guilt, shame, and fear, and work through those feelings to some extent, if that doesn't happen, if you don't learn to push against those impulses, those energies, I don't know that you'll make any meaningful progress. At least I've never seen somebody make meaningful progress without having to break through and work through those feelings of guilt, shame, and fear. Ultimately, in the end, you make peace and serenity your responsibility, independent to a large extent of your child's progress and struggles. I'm going to say that one last time because that's a good place to end. Ultimately, you take on your peace and your serenity as your responsibility and make those things independent of your child's progress and stress. Now, I'm a father, and I did not know that I could love children as much as I love my children. I didn't know that I could love anybody as much as I love my children. And having said that, ultimately, I want to give my children the gift of taking on the responsibility for my peace, my serenity, and the meaning of my life. That's the burden that I will carry for myself so that they will not carry for themselves, and they will do it if I let them, and it will come at the cost of who they are, of their authentic selves, and of their mental health and well-being. All right. Any questions that you have, please send those in to Lindsay, my moderator, and then I'll take those after I go over the upcoming announcements. We ask all current parents to come to a parent workshop if at all possible. The next one will be in our Southern Utah program, January 25th, 2020. So if you can come, please come. Multifamily parent education. You can combine that with a visit to see your child if the therapist thinks that the timing is right. We have one in February each month. We have one in February 15th in our Oregon program. So each month, go to our website or email melanie@evoketherapy.com for more information there. The next support group, I'll come up with a list of more for 2020, but the next one will be Monday in New York City, Monday, January 27th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time at the City University of New York on, I believe it's 35th Avenue and 5th Avenue, 35th Street and 5th Avenue. Any questions about upcoming support groups, go to our website or email melanie@evoketherapy.com. If you want to do a deep dive, I can't think of anything you can do that's more valuable to this process besides sending your child, is do finding you. Do a 4.5 day workshop. The January one is already full, so you can get on the waiting list there or sign up for our February 19th through 23rd workshop. We'll start having 2 a month if we get enough people to come. Right now, they're filling up about a month in advance, so we're getting close to needing to open up 2 per month. So sign up for February 19th through 23rd. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information or for upcoming RSV upcoming intensives. We have pursuits trips for families and individuals. Think therapy light or sober fun. Those can be anywhere in the world using any activity with any of our staff. From a few days to 30 days, customized programs. We ask all parents to at least try 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Codependence Anonymous. Go to CODA.org, Families Anonymous. Go to familiesanonymous.org. AdultChildren.org is for people who grew up in toxic, unhealthy, unsafe families. Alateen is for teenagers. RefugeRecovery.org is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less of a focus on higher power, more on mindfulness. The National Alliance on Mental Illness can be found at NAMI.org, NAMI.org, for free classes and information in your area. All of these broadcasts are available on your podcast app on an iPhone or iOS device using the podcast app. On an Android device, use the SoundCloud app, or on your computer, you go to soundcloud.com. On Twitter and Instagram, you can keep up to date with inspirational stories, pictures, upcoming events. Find Evoke Therapy programs using the handle @EvokeTherapy. You can also find the Summit Lodge. That's our intensive program. On Instagram, using the handle @Evoke Summit Lodge. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs. The Alumni Foundation, an organization of alumni families that have banded together to help people that can't afford therapy. You can find that on Facebook by searching Evoke Family Foundation. And then, of course, our blog has upcoming information. My first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon, like I said, in a few weeks. The next book, The Audacity to Be You, will also be available on Amazon. Go through the Parent Alumni Foundation book page through the Amazon Smiles program. If you do so, a percentage of the proceeds goes toward the foundation to help people that can't afford therapy. All right, happy to take questions. First question. Parent asks, if we are in both individual and couples therapy for months now, why is the group programs, Al-Anon, etc., needed too? Our son is in Entrada. It's not necessarily that you do all that I'm saying all the time. Those are for people that haven't tried it. I would still encourage you to try it. It's free. If you're in a relatively decent sized city, they're happening 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day all over the city within driving distance of you. So even just hearing it would be important. I ask all our new therapists to go. I was asked to go when I first started off doing this work, I think it's nice to hear you're really going to listen to a group of people who have had to cope with an unsolvable equation in their life, and that is a loved one who's struggling. So I my main practice is therapy. And then I read. That's my main practice. I go to Al-Anon or Coda occasionally, and I learn about and remind myself of the principles through the podcast, the reading that I do in my therapy session. So I'm not trying to tell you that one. I just want exposure. I just want you to try it. If you have a great practice that feels to you like you're getting all that you need, you might still just try a couple and then realize that that might not be for you. Or you might. So many people over the years have tried it at the invitation that we made and have said later they didn't think it was for them, and it has been a life-saving thing for them. I think the two things can complement each other. But if you have a practice where you're finding your serenity, your differentiation, treatment for your own mental health and well-being that works for you, then that can be okay too. Any other questions come in? Is there a way to share our feelings with our kids without manipulation? Oh, that's a great question. Um, I don't know. I don't see it very often. The real question has to be answered. Well, there are two parts to the equation of your question, to the answer of your question. Number one, you have to reflect honestly on yourself. If your intent is to suggest to the child that they ought to or need to or are obligated to change their behavior so that you feel better, that's a problem. That's a big problem. So if that's your intent and really only you can answer that, then don't do it. That's the first part of the equation. That's the you part of the equation. The second part of the equation is this: children can't carry our feelings. They really can't. They were never intended to take care of us. That's not the deal. We may have been told that by our parents that that was our responsibility, but child psychologists don't believe that at all. Right? People who study attachment, which is the quality of the relationship between the parent and child, the secure base that a parent can possibly provide for a child, they don't think it's a child's job to provide the sense of safety to the parent at all. So I hesitate, strongly hesitate, to suggest that sharing your feelings with your child is an important part of the equation. Sharing it with somebody is important. I encourage you to share it with a therapist, a sponsor, a support group, so that you work it out there, so that when you're interacting with the child, you're there for them. If you don't work it out there, it will most likely get mixed up so that they feel some unconscious obligation to take care of you. It's a great question. The exploration of it is subtle and difficult, I can just tell you, the longer I've been in this, um, the less value I see year after year of parents expressing feelings toward children. The ideal is you express them to own them. You say things to your children like, "This is not your responsibility. I will take care of it, but this is how it's affecting me." And you say it in the context of, "I'm sorry I lashed out," or "I'm sorry I was nagging," or "I'm sorry I was asking you the same question 10 times. I was just feeling anxious, but that's my job." If you can express it in those kinds of terms, over time, that can be helpful. Again, children are inclined and then kind of wired to take it on. But that would be the valid reason to own it, to own the feeling and the responsibility for that feeling yourself. That would be the positive side of sharing feelings with your child. If we already have a family therapist, can we use her to help us through this? If so, how? Yes, absolutely. You can, if you have a family therapist, use them. Um, I believe in individual therapy. I'm trained. My PhD is in marriage and family therapy, so that's what I was trained as. But my experience is there's so much work. I don't go to family therapy nearly as often as I go to individual therapy. So it's just my preference. My new book, The Audacity to Be You, is based on the premise that every difficulty we have in any relationship is really based on the relationship we have with ourselves. So, yes, if you have a great family therapist at home, do it. If not, ask them if they'll see you individually. Some will. I'll see individual family members individually, also as a family. Some don't believe in that. I have found that to be as or more effective than parsing it out for everybody. If they don't want to see you alone, ask for somebody to for them to recommend somebody. And again, come to an intensive. Go to an intensive somewhere. Um, if you don't know what your work is, an intensive is a great place to figure that out. It's a fantastic place to figure it out. I recommend it to everybody. We've sent dozens of employees there. I've sent everybody in my family there, not by force by any means, by invitation, and all of them have taken it. Every single person in my immediate family has participated in an intensive. Now the 11-year-old just a little bit, but everybody has participated in intensive work in our family. And my young adult children are asking to go back a second time to one. So, and I've been to about 10 myself. Somebody asked, what about your feelings about what aftercare program would be best? Are those not really feelings? Well, you can have feeling. Again, it's the weight of the feelings and where you place it. I can sort through feelings with my children about various things. It's when I it's hard to describe, but it's basically when I put the weight and responsibility of my feelings onto them, when I imply or suggest that they need to change so I feel okay, that's when it becomes a problem. Um, but yeah, I talk about feelings about politics with my children, about world events, about sadness, things that happen in my life that are sad. My kids will always stare at me during a movie because dad's going to be the first one that cries. I'm expressive with feelings. It's just I try, I aspire to not hand over my serenity, the responsibility for my serenity, my peace of mind over to my children. But we can have discussions about a lot of things, feelings about aftercare and so forth for sure. I I, I like it. I love it when parents say, "I'm sad that you're going away to aftercare. I'm sad that I feel like that's the right choice to make." When I dropped my son off at aftercare, my oldest at aftercare when he was a teenager, I cried tremendously, and I also didn't doubt it. I knew it was the right decision, but it was painful. So it's more about the weight and responsibility of your peace and serenity, placing that on the child, making them responsible for it. All right, thank you all. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for joining us. I don't have the next broadcast will be Thursday, January 2nd. I'll come up with a subject tomorrow and send that out. So haven't decided on that yet. Thank you for and on behalf of your children for joining us during these broadcasts. If you're joining us live, thank you for joining us live. If you're listening to it afterwards on the webinar through the portal or on the podcast app, I thank you for and on behalf of your children. It makes a difference in their lives for you to do your work. Thanks all. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you in a few days. Bye bye.